for the ding dong. The ding. There's the ding. Okay, right. We've been talking at some length about Nematoda, and currently they're divided into two major classes, Chromadoria and Enoplia. There's a lot of non-parasitic species in the Enoplia. Most of the parasitic members are in a subclass of Enoplia called Dorilema. That includes the trichinellids, which we talked about on Friday, the ones that cause trichinosis and intestinal threadworm. The ones that we haven't talked about yet are Dioctophymatida, muspiceids, and mermithids, plus two additional subclasses that don't contain animal parasites. Should have warned you. Great example of Dioctophymatida is Dioctophyma renale, the kidney nematode. Normally it is a parasite of mink. There are other mammals that can be hosts. Normally you get this from consuming fish. And if a dog, for example, happens to eat infected fish, it can come down with this. The worm finds its way to the kidney and basically replaces the kidney tissue with itself. So that's one worm coiled up inside the connective tissue capsule that would normally cover the kidney. There have been cases of humans getting this. I don't think it's very common. But yeah, yet another reason to cook your food reasonably well, because you could get this from eating undercooked freshwater fish. Since this is a worm that lives in the kidney, eggs pass out in the urine, they hatch in fresh water, and the larvae parasitize aquatic oligochaetes. You might remember when we talked about segmented worms, oligochaetes are the ones that have very few bristles. Earthworms are an example, but there's also lots of small, thread-like, millimeter thick and, maybe 10, 20 millimeters long, aquatic oligochaetes, ones that live in water. I showed you a picture of one called tubifex. Larvae parasitize those. A mink that happens to eat an infected worm can be parasitized directly. That doesn't happen all that often. I don't think mink deliberately seek out nearly microscopic oligochaetes to eat, but they could end up getting them, in with the rest of their food, perhaps. Probably more likely is for a fish to eat an infected worm, because a lot of freshwater fish do depend on little oligochaetes as a food supply. The larvae form resting cysts inside the fish, and these will infect a mink that eats the fish, or for that matter, a dog that eats the fish. This is just yet another example of the fish being a paratenic host. Slightly gross picture here. There's another dioctophymid called Eustrongylides, where the adults burrow into the wall of aquatic birds' crops. The crop being the food storage expanded pouch at the upper end of the digestive tract. And Eustrongylides burrows into the wall of that. Eggs are passed in feces. Larvae infect oligochaete worms and then infect fish. And there you've got one that's been removed from a fish. And then, of course, it would infect a fish-eating bird if a fish-eating bird ate it. Eustrongylides, there we've got, I guess that's a minnow with a infective Eustrongylides. That's rare, but you can get it from eating raw fish. And I have to mention there was a case reported by the CDC of 15 Maryland fishermen. 3 of them developed severe stomach pain because they got infected with Eustrongylides because they'd all been swallowing their live bait. I don't really know why they were swallowing their own live bait minnows. I am assuming that alcohol was involved. Oh, my wife, who knows because her father was a commercial fisherman, says that it's actually a tradition. But then, okay, sweetie, they were swallowing their bait, not their catch. Okay, she says it's a fish. I'm sorry, she says it's a tradition. That still doesn't mean that large quantities of alcohol were not involved as well. Anyway, these are not easily treatable by antiparasitic drugs because they're not in the lumen, the open space inside the gut. They're burrowed into the wall, and in severe cases, surgery might be required. So I know it's an ancient and honored tradition, but yeah, don't swallow your live bait minnows and you should be fine. Okay. Mermithids are arthropod parasites. They don't parasitize vertebrates that I've ever heard, and they probably should be called parasitoids because they kill their host. They'll mature inside the body cavity, such as the body cavity of this fire ant, and then burst out when they're mature, destroying the host in the process. So since, as far as I know, the host always dies, these would be better considered parasitoids than parasites per se. They don't actually feed as adults. The gut, in fact, is disconnected. There's no esophagus, there's no anus, there's kind of a sac in the middle of the body, but it's not connected to the outside. While they are inside their host, they can absorb nutrients through the cuticle. They'll also store food from the pre-parasitic stages, but as adults, they don't feed. There you've got one emerging from a mosquito larva, which is good news for anybody who lives in Arkansas, that there are mermithid species that are effective at invading and destroying mosquito larvae. There have been experiments, in fact, with using these for biological control. So there you have skeeter doom. That is pre-parasitic nematode juveniles of the species Rhesomermus nielseni, known to infect 22 different mosquito species in the wild. So the pre-parasitic juveniles will penetrate mosquito larvae, develop into parasitic juveniles. The post-parasitics are the ones that burst out of the gut, they molt one more time and then mate, and then die anywhere from 7 days to a year afterwards. So I don't know if you can purchase these now, but there was at least a time when they were commercially produced as an experiment in mosquito larva control. So there. The fourth group is the muspiceids, and I'll say very little about them because nobody knows anything about them. Like mermithids, when they're adults, they lose their connection between the gut and the outside. There's still the remains of a gut in there, but it is no longer connected to a mouth or to an anus. Nobody seems to know very much about them. This happens to be one that forms swellings under the skin of Japanese bats. Maybe anybody who becomes an exotic animal vet might conceivably have to deal with these at some point down the road. I'm not aware of them parasitizing any species of veterinary importance. And, you know, I'm just saying, if you're not sure what to do for a career, it wouldn't take too much effort to become the world expert on muspiceids. Mind you, might be a little bit tricky getting a job. I didn't say I gave good career advice, but yeah, something to think about for maybe 2 seconds before you don't think about it. Anyway, so yeah, not very much seems to be known about muspiceids. Okay, we finished talking about the Enoplia. The other major class of nematodes is Chromadoria, and they also include an awful lot of non-parasitic species. They also include many species that are plant parasites, which are outside the scope of this course. There's many free-living species in an order of the Chromadoria called the Rhabditida, and that includes, for example, Rhabditis elegans, the one I showed you back last Wednesday, I think, that is used so much as a model organism in developmental biology and aging research. The one that Dr. Ferris works on in her lab, if you know her, or you get a chance to work with her. She does research on the aging process using Rhabditis elegans. But that order also includes parasites within 3 suborders: Tylenchina, Rhabditina, and Spirurina. Tylenchids are very diverse ecologically. Many species are free-living. Many of them live in decaying matter. C. elegans is not a tylenchid, but it's the same deal, that it tends to live in places like compost piles. Scavenging animals will often swallow them easily, and so it's been fairly easy for tylenchids to evolve both facultative and obligate parasite stages. And I'm kind of excited about this because I wasn't planning on doing this for a lab, because I didn't really get the idea for it until a few days ago. But there's something I'm going to try at the end of the course. It's not really a full-blown lab, but I want to see if I can develop it into one. Here is Heterorhabditis bacteriophora. It is a tylenchid. It's probably more accurately called a parasitoid than a parasite, because it also kills its host. Although you could say that Heterorhabditis itself doesn't kill its host. Instead, it goes around with a colony of the bacterium Photorhabdus in its intestine. And the cool thing about Photorhabdus is that it's bioluminescent. You can see it down there below. That green glow is the part of the intestine that contains the Photorhabdus. So Heterorhabditis dour juveniles, remember dour is that stage, it's equivalent to J3, a 3rd stage juvenile. That's the resistant stage that doesn't feed and may not spend a lot of time moving and can live independently for quite some time. Dowers of Heterorhabditis will crawl up onto places like moss, leaflets, grass blades, crumbs of soil, and extend themselves vertically and just stand there. It looks like they're standing on their tails. And they'll wait for an unsuspecting bug to stroll by. And then they'll crawl or even launch themselves towards that bug. If they succeed, they'll latch onto the bug and burrow into the bug's body, often through the spiracles, the air holes. Once they're inside, they don't actually feed on the bug. What they do is molt and release Photorhabdus, release the bacteria. And it's the bacteria that multiply within the insect's bloodstream. Within 48 hours, the insect is dead of massive infection. And since, incidentally, Photorhabdus is bioluminescent, the dead insect glows. So Heterorhabditis then feeds on the Photorhabdus. It's almost like Heterorhabditis is a farmer, right? It releases Photorhabdus into the insect like a farmer spreading seed on his field. The bacteria consume the insides of the insect. Heterorhabditis then feeds on the bacteria. It digests some, but it'll save some for later. Actually, it'll reproduce The offspring all pick up some Photorhabdus bacteria for later, and then they come bursting out of the larva, which is what you see down below. That's probably a waxworm moth larva, having turned reddish brown because it's dead. Normally these would be whitish. And surrounding it, all of those little white things, that's a whole bunch of Heterorhabditis bursting out of that larva and crawling out to infect some more. And you can actually buy Heterorhabditis on Amazon. This is one of 3 common species, Heterorhabditis and 2 species of something called Steinernema, that are commercially sold for pest control. Heterorhabditis is very effective against beetles and grubs and true bugs. Steinernema, I think, tends to be better against flies and fleas. You could conceivably treat your yard for fleas using this. And you can buy bags full of Heterorhabditis dower larvae, spread them in your garden, and they'll parasitize and quickly kill noxious insects that you don't want in there. It's a pesticide-free means of pest control. And I'm going to see if I can make this work in lab. I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to do it, but I think it would be cool for future generations to be able to make their own glow-in-the-dark waxworm moth larvae dying a horrible death, and I want to see how it's done. So we might get to play with those at the very end. It's not something I've done before. More of a true parasite, Strongyloides, another tylenchid, infects a pretty wide range of animals. One of them, Strongyloides stercoralis, is a human parasite. The common name is threadworm. There's a couple of them. Mild infection may be asymptomatic, but Strongyloides was one of the infections that this was noted all the way back in the early 80s. It tended to get really bad in AIDS patients. This was one of several things, like a rare type of cancer called Kaposi's sarcoma and a lung-infecting yeast called pneumocystis. And there were a couple of others, and this is another one, infections that HIV-positive patients tended to get. So if you're immunocompromised, this can be a lot more serious, having Strongyloides. The adults are gut parasites. They shed eggs. These are what eggs look like. You cannot easily see the shell, but every one of those little coiled up things that looks like a Cheerio is a larval nematode coiled up inside an egg. Unlike many parasites, these eggs hatch while they're still in the intestine. Many parasites, the eggs have to hatch outside the host's body. That's true for hookworm. That's true for threadworm. That's true for not trichinella. That's true for whipworm. We saw that way back when we were talking about coccidian protists. Many parasites have propagules, eggs or cysts or whatnot, that need to mature outside the host body. Strongyloides, excuse me, eggs hatch still inside the body. And this makes this one of the relatively few one of the relatively few parasites that can auto-infect. Larvae that are in the intestine can penetrate the lining of the intestine, get into the bloodstream, migrate to other organs, and end up back in the small intestine and become adults. This is the species that was found in World War II veterans 60 years after they'd fought in the Pacific. As far as I know, they never noticed that they had it. As I mentioned, a low-grade infection might not be particularly symptomatic. But this is one of the relatively few parasites that can auto-infect. There's a word on this diagram, if you can see it, that is one we haven't seen before. There are larvae that are called filariform larvae. Filaria refers to nematodes that travel in the bloodstream. The heartworm juveniles that half of you saw last week and the other half will see this Thursday, those juveniles in the bloodstream are called filarias. Specifically, that species is Dirofilaria immitis. So the eggs will hatch into relatively stumpy larvae called rhabditiforms. In autoinfection, the rhabditiforms will transform into filariforms, penetrate the lining of the intestine, migrate to other organs, and some will end up in the small intestine and become adults. Other eggs may hatch in the feces, live as free-living adult worms in the soil, produce eggs in the soil, and then eggs in the soil develop into rhabditiform larvae that transform into filariforms and penetrate the skin. So this is an odd parasite because it can persist in the soil for some time. The adults can live outside the body and produce eggs outside the body. I don't think those eggs that are produced outside the body can transform into adults without going through a host. So they still need a host for completion of that life cycle. But still, it's interesting to see a parasite that can spend, if it auto-infects, it may never leave the host. On the other hand, it can spend a sizable chunk of its lifespan outside a host, which is kind of a neat trick. Vets, there are other species that will cause health problems in horses. This is a relative, Strongyloides westeri, that's actually transmitted in milk. Rather a sinister development there. The eggs pass out in feces, the larvae molt. The larvae can live in soil for some time before they penetrate into horses as filaria. This very thin stage that can travel through the bloodstream. Transmission results because the filaria can travel to the mammary glands of a mare. So there's a diagram of the life cycle. The parasitic juveniles travel to the mammary glands. They're passed on to a foal. Within the foal, they develop into females, and they're parthenogenetic. And they lay eggs by asexual reproduction that hatch. Those eggs can develop either indirectly into free-living. Those eggs pass out of the body, and they can develop into free-living males and females that reproduce sexually. Or they can develop directly into larvae that develop into filariaforms. And then those filariaforms can penetrate through the skin of a horse. And if it's a mare, they'll end up in the mammary glands, and round goes the cycle of life. I'm not sure I explained that very well. Eggs inside the intestine of the foal can develop into a free-living sexual stage that lays eggs that develop into infective juveniles, or they can lay eggs that develop directly into infective juveniles. So there's this optional sexual stage, which is the only stage at which males appear. So really kind of weird how that life cycle switch hits, and that life cycle can be so plastic. And again, like Strongyloides stercoralis, you have this potentially relatively long stage spent outside of the host as a free-living animal, which is weird. Okay, good grief. Did I finish that soon? Tell you what, I'll let me swap the slides, and I'm going to go ahead and keep going because I feel like I'm on a roll. And what we've got coming up, a bit of Arkansas history, well, U.S. history in general. So, not that. I'm going to go ahead and change over the presentation. And we're going to get a little ahead of ourselves, but this is worth finding out about. Okay. All right. So we were talking about chromadoria, and I've said all I'm going to about the tylenchids. Those include the insect parasitoids like Heterorhabditis, and they also include Strongyloides. The Rhabditina includes the order Strongylida. They are primarily gut and lung parasites of vertebrates. They include a lot of veterinary parasites. You can often tell the males because they've got a really big copulatory bursa. You might recall that male nematodes, well, nematodes have to copulate because the sperm can't swim, and males often have various gizmos that latch onto the female, hold open her vulva, and transfer the sperm. And male apparatus often includes a pair of flaps that make a structure called the copulatory bursa, and it tends to be really big in strongylids. And the one I'll talk about today is hookworm. Hookworm lives in the intestines. It feeds on blood. There are species, I believe, that dogs and cats can get, but I'll focus on human hookworm. You'll notice in this micrograph that the head is hooked, duh, and the mouth is perpetually open. The mouth opens into this open space called a buccal capsule, and that's connected to a very powerful pumping esophagus because these worms are bloodsuckers. And it's hard to see in this picture, but that buccal capsule is surrounded by gripping and cutting plates. In genus Ancylostoma, you can see that the plates are toothed. They're smooth-edged like knife blades in genus Necator. And I'll be focusing on Necator americanus, Latin for American killer, for today. So hooked head with that perpetually open buccal capsule surrounded by plates, sharp ones. And then the males have this really big copulatory bursa that's supported by tissue thickenings called rays, almost looking like a pair of fish fins or something like that. So males have these big fans at the ends of their bodies with large spicules that are used to hold the female vulva open during sperm transfer. So adult hookworm lives in human intestines. Eggs are passed out in feces. There's an early laid egg on the left and a later one. You can see the egg on the left you can still see individual cells. The later stage egg, you can see the embryo clearly curled up in there. And these eggs will hatch in 24 to 48 hours. The larvae can survive in the soil for up to 6 odd weeks. Insects like dung beetles, which are called coprophagus, meaning they eat poop, can actually spread the eggs some distance, and the burrowing of dung beetles can also speed up development by bringing oxygen into the feces. So these are transmitted when you poop on soil. The eggs hatch into juvenile larvae that feed on fecal matter. They molt twice, and then the J3 stage, notice it's called a faleriform larva. Those don't feed. They sit there and they wait their chance to penetrate host skin. So you get these by contacting your bare skin close to a place where somebody has defecated on the soil. And they can live for several weeks. These faleriform larvae, they're carried by the circulatory system once they penetrate into the human body. They end up in the lungs. At the lungs, they get coughed up. And if you swallow your hocker, they get carried down to the gut. That's where they mature and they reproduce. So there is a close-up of gut lining with a couple of hookworms. And they'll use that big buccal capsule with the sharp plates to do this. That's a cross-section. To the left is intestinal wall. To the right is the worm. That kind of stripy pink thing towards the upper right is actually a section through the esophagus and the muscle fibers that enable it to pump. You're seeing the buccal capsule, and you can see there's a whole fold of gut lining tissue that's been pulled up into that buccal capsule, and the worm is latching onto that with those piercing and cutting plates. These worms actually secrete a lot of substances. There are some that inhibit the immune response. I came across a whole paper on things that hookworms secrete. Some of them inhibit neutrophils. That's the population of white blood cells that's usually mobilized when you get a parasite. They also secrete anticoagulant peptides. The anticoagulants work in a unique way. They inhibit a clotting factor that others don't. The anticoagulant has been patented and testing clinically as a clot-busting drug. I actually looked this up about an hour ago, but wasn't able to find current trial results. So I don't know if this is going to be, a great medical discovery or not. But it's interesting that, something that a parasite produces might actually turn out to be medicinal. Kind of neat there. You may not have heard very much about hookworm, but it used to be one of the big killers in this country. Despite being called Necator americanus, it's actually native to Africa, and it was brought to the New World by African slaves. And hookworm used to be endemic in the American South. There was an average of 40% of the population infected with hookworm, in some counties over 90%. People of African and European descent could both get it, but Africans had some degree of natural immunity. The effects were far and away the worst in poor rural whites. And you have to remember, the eggs pass out in feces, and the larvae hatch and molt a couple of times, free living in the soil. And then the faleriform J3 larvae leave the soil and penetrate into human bare skin. In the rural American South, in many areas there weren't even outhouses, or if there were, they weren't dug deeply enough. It wasn't that uncommon, if you needed to relieve yourself, to just find a tree and go behind it and take care of your business. And even places like schools and churches might not even have an outhouse. They'd just be a tree that anybody who needed could go behind and use. And so if you contacted the ground with bare skin within 6 feet of any place where somebody had copped a squat in the previous several months, you could have hookworm filaria burrowing into your skin. Common in the places where people went barefoot a lot of the time. and you don't actually have to step in somebody's poop. You have to step on soil that's within 6 feet of a place where somebody has pooped sometime in the past few months. And this is what it does to you. The main symptom of hookworm infection is iron deficiency anemia. These worms are bloodsuckers. Each one only takes something like, I want to say, like 1/4 millimeter of blood per worm per day. And if it was just one worm, you could live with that. But if you're infected by tens of thousands of these, and you're constantly getting reinfected because you're walking around with bare feet, then the effects are really bad. You end up with chronic iron deficiency anemia. When that hits children, it can stunt their cognitive development. If it hits pregnant women, it can increase the risk of miscarriage. One of the odder symptoms of hookworm infection was the uncontrollable desire to eat dirt. This is actually a picture of an old road somewhere in the American South. I forget where. And there's this dugout spot under the roots of a tree. And it's dug out because this is where the local people would come to swallow the local dirt. The local dirt there happened to be red clay, which being rich in iron, people probably were craving anything with iron in it to counteract the loss of iron through the chronic intestinal bleeding that you get with hookworm. Unfortunately, you could end up accidentally swallowing hookworm larvae if you eat dirt. As I mentioned, each worm may only survive for a few months before being shed. Mild infections may not be symptomatic. If you only have a few, you can cope with that. But when reinfections persist, when you're constantly getting infected because you're constantly putting your bare skin on soil within a few feet of a place where somebody has copped a squat in the preceding few months, you're constantly getting reinfected. And of course, just general poverty and malnutrition don't help matters. In that case, hookworm can be really severe. So circa 1910, here's a gentleman from Woodbine, Kentucky, with the wasted body and swollen belly that's typical of heavy chronic hookworm infection. There's a stereotype of, and it is applied sometimes to both poor whites as well as to black folk, that they're chronically lazy. There's an old joke about the Ozark hillbilly who's, spends all of his time sitting on the front porch. And he tells a stranger, "Yep, I'm a real go-getter. My wife works 12 hours a day, and I go get her." You don't have to laugh at that. It's not meant to be funny. To the extent that the stereotype of lazy rural Southerners has any truth to it at all, it has everything to do with hookworm. Hookworm used to be called the germ of laziness because that chronic anemia simply saps your energy. Our hillbilly sitting on the front porch might have actually wanted, if he'd had his druthers, to be up and working. He just didn't have the energy to do it. Mark Twain, guy who wrote Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, towards the end of his life, had some very sarcastic comments on hookworm in a book called Letters from the Earth, which was the history of the world told from Satan's point of view. I won't read the whole thing, but Satan claims that God devised a special affliction agent for each and every detail of man's structure, overlooking not a single one. Many poor people have to go barefoot because they cannot afford shoes. The Creator saw his opportunity. The disease induced by the hookworm had been doing its evil work here and there, but it was never suspected to be a disease at all. The people who had it were merely supposed to be lazy and were despised when they should have been pitied. The hookworm is a sneaking and underhanded invention, but that physician and his helpers will exterminate it now. Yeah, Mark Twain was really bitter in his last years and didn't really feel the need to hold back, indicting God for coming up with such a rotten idea. Anyway, 1910, the year that Twain published that and the year that he died, the Rockefeller Commission mounted an anti-hookworm campaign throughout the South. Here they are distributing hookworm medicine. They also tried to educate the public on the need for better sanitation. The medicine didn't always work. I mean, the medicine was effective, but if you go into a rural southern community and say, "Hi there, here's some medicine. If you take it, you'll feel better. Bye." How many people are going to comply? It was kind of uphill work to get the locals to trust the doctors coming in enough to take that medicine that they were given. The commission also produced educational aids. That's the illustration from a book they printed called The Story of a Boy. In the background, you can see an overflowing outhouse. There's the boy sitting, and you can see the little filarial hookworms burrowing into his toes, while that dog says, "Oh, you hookworms." This showed how hookworm was spread. And they tried to get people to dig outhouses, dig them deep enough. Those worms can travel 6 feet, so dig your outhouse deeper than 6 feet, and they won't be able to, come out onto the ground. In some rural counties, infection rates were high into the 1950s, but the introduction of sewage treatment eventually got the control in the rural South, and that's strongly correlated with a rise in literacy and economic productivity. It is showing resurgence in a few places. It tends to be in rural areas where these days, instead of slaves or sharecroppers, you have migrant workers working in the fields. They're no more likely to be unclean than anybody else, but if they're not given adequate bathroom breaks, they'll tend to relieve themselves on the soil, and then we have the problem over again. State of California has rules that, migrant workers picking, fruits and veg in the fields have to be provided by law with adequate bathroom facilities, with running water and adequate time to use them. And it's not so much because they're feeling humanitarian, it's because there's several diseases that can be spread if you don't treat human excrement carefully in an agricultural setting. And in places where that's not done, I'm told there is been a bit of a resurgence of hookworm. It's no longer the major social problem that it was, but it has not gone away. And just general rule, I showed you that. We'll see this again, that you often get better results instead of just coming in and swooping in with a solution. If you get the people on your side and teach them and get them to accept for themselves get them to realize for themselves what you tend to get much better results, even if it does result in some rather grotesque kids' book illustrations. That dirty foot with the filaria burrowing in is just kind of horrifying, but it had its, expected effect. Okay, right. I am going to stop recording as soon as my screen comes back. And there we have the story of hookworm. That's actually gotten me a little bit ahead of where I'd meant to be. And recording will stop